There are 20 traps that you want to avoid when it comes to planning a natural birth. Like, these are things that you would not expect. Some of them you might already know because I've talked about them in the past, but there's 20 of them that I really nailed down and wrote down in the guide. If you want that guide, you can go to www.empoweringmomsbirth.com/store and you can check it out. It's right up at the top. It's one of the free guides that you can download, and it will give you the actual list of 20 traps. So we're going to do the first 5 today, and I'm going to take a deep dive. All right, so what are the first 5 traps that you want to avoid when planning a natural birth? Number 1, growth scans at the end of your pregnancy to guess how big your baby is. If you're doing this, if you're having a growth scan at the end of your pregnancy, you know what's going to happen is that it's going to undermine your confidence. Either you're going to be told your baby is too big or you're going to be told your baby is too small. And both these things can lead to being pushed into an induction. In fact, this happened to me. I wasn't having a too big baby. I was having a too small baby. And at 35 weeks, sure enough, I was told I was measuring behind, and they told me that my baby wasn't growing properly. And then what happened is that ultimately I ended up being told that I had to have non-stress tests. I couldn't have my baby at home anymore. I had to have my baby in the hospital. They told me that he might not tolerate labor well. They told me that I might need to be induced. They told me I might need a C-section. Because I asked the right question, which was, how is my baby doing now? I was able to avoid that. But oftentimes what happens is that your care provider will offer these growth scans or do it as a matter of routine, and then they predict the size of your baby. So you want to avoid that. You don't want anybody to be predicting the size of your baby. First of all, growth scans can be off in as much as 5 pounds in either direction. And the only way to predict the size of your baby is after your baby is born and they weigh your baby. Number 2, due dates. Your baby will come when they're ready. And this might be 42 weeks. This might be 44 weeks. This might be 37 weeks. It's a big range. Your baby has their own timeline for growth, and it may not be exactly what the textbook says. So when your care provider gives you that arbitrary due date of 40 weeks, what they're really saying is, if you don't go into labor by this point, we're going to start doing things to you. If, however, your care provider is like, well, it can come anywhere between 37 weeks and 42 weeks, and if your baby is at 42 weeks, we'll discuss what you can do. You could still remain pregnant a little bit after that, but we'll be monitoring you, or we'll figure out something. We can discuss that later. But the fact is that there's babies out there who have been born at 44 weeks perfectly healthy. It all depends on your own family's gestational history. So if you go back to your grandmother and your mother and anyone who was born before the 90s who happened to have not been induced, because induction became a really big thing after the 90s and a little bit before that, but before that, we didn't have that technology. So you just remained pregnant. In fact, my own grandmother, she ended up giving birth at 44 weeks with her 4th, and they just were like, well, you just stay pregnant. And the same thing with Gloria LeMay. Like, she talked about this, how she had just stayed pregnant. That's what they did in the 70s. It wasn't until the 90s to 2000s that induction became a thing. And then suddenly everybody was getting induced at 40 weeks and 41 weeks and now 39 weeks. So your baby will come when your baby's ready. There's a reason why you want to go the full 40, but there's 40 reasons to go the full 40. And you don't want to just induce just because you've hit your due date. Number 3, vaginal exams. Vaginal exams are a huge problem, especially with maternity care, because it undermines your confidence. And when you have a vaginal exam, your cervix, first of all, doesn't like to be checked. Your cervix would rather not be checked at all. And it's uncomfortable. It can cause bleeding. It can also weaken the membranes if your care provider decides that while they're in there, they'll do a membrane sweep. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But the fact is that vaginal exams tell you absolutely nothing. You can go your entire pregnancy without having a vaginal exam and still have a healthy baby in the end. You can go your entire labor without having a vaginal exam and still have a healthy baby in the end. Your body is doing a physiological process. You don't need vaginal exams. The only time that vaginal exams are actually useful is if you're choosing not to have a physiological birth. If you're choosing to induce and you want to know where you're at to decide whether you're going to have a C-section or whether you're going to plan an induction based on your chances of what's likely to happen. That's the only time that a vaginal exam is actually necessary. Or if you feel that you're going into preterm labor, maybe you want to see if your cervix is opening. Number 4, I already hinted at this, membrane sweeps. Don't fool yourself. This is still an induction. Even if your care provider presents it to you in a way that says, well, you know, let's do this membrane sweep to avoid this induction. Guess what? You are having an induction when they are doing a sweep. They can accidentally break your waters. They're weakening the membranes. The membranes could end up prematurely releasing, which means that then your waters release and then contractions don't start. And then you're put on the drip because they need to get things going because now you have no bag of waters. If you'd never had that membrane sweep, maybe your waters would have remained intact and then you would have had an easier, smoother labor, because another thing is when your waters are intact during labor, you've got a nice squishy water balloon as opposed to a bowling ball on your cervix. So you don't want a membrane sweep. And finally, you do not want the stress from other people trying to push you into unwanted tests and interventions. Stress is a killer of oxytocin. Stress blocks oxytocin receptors in your uterus. And oxytocin receptors in your uterus are what allow you to go into labor. If you're feeling really stressed and fearful, what's going to happen is that it's going to feel like a tiger is chasing you. And if you feel like a tiger is chasing you, if this was happening in the wild, what would happen is that your body would shut down labor process. This is what happens to mammals. If mammals feel threatened, they're not going to continue to birth because it's not safe to birth in that moment. So you don't want that stress. In order to protect yourself from that stress, you need to have the 5 pillars of empowerment. So what are the 5 pillars? You need to have the right mindset. You need to know that you're in charge. You need to get past your fears, and you need to be able to keep yourself in a positive frame of mind, not feeling that something's going to go wrong. You need to have the right education. A really good step is getting the right books, getting the right childbirth education, understanding physiological birth and how things work. Rachel Reed's book, Why Induction Matters, helps with induction. Rachel Reed's other book, Reclaiming Childbirth as a Rite of Passage, helps you understand physiological birth. The Thinking Woman's Guide to a Better Birth by Hensi Goer is a book that also gives you the breakdown of the risks and benefits of interventions. So these 3 books alone will help you to figure out whether or not you want to change your birth plan, how to create your birth plan. And of course, my new book, Your Empowered Birth, will also walk you through the practical steps that you can take in planning a birth so you can get the birth you want without having to fight, beg, or compromise. So when you're dealing with the right education and you have the right education, when you have the right education, what happens is that then you can create the right environment. You can recognize how oxytocin works in your body and what you can do to avoid stress. So you need to create the right environment around you, the right learning environment, the right birthing environment, and the right physical environment that you need as you continue your pregnancy in order to stay calm. The next one is that you need to have the right facilitators. You need to have the right childbirth educator. You need to have the right doula, and you need to have the right care provider. When you're avoiding the natural birth traps, the last thing you want is a care provider that's going to push you right into it. Because even though you might know that this is a natural birth trap, it is incredibly stressful to have to keep fighting with your care provider. So get rid of that stress by hiring the right care provider in the first place. And finally, you need to have the right support. Your friends, your family, your partner, they need to be on board with your birth plan. If they're the ones that are asking you, well, how dilated are you? Or saying stuff about due dates, or suggesting that your baby is going to be too big or too small, and they're freaking out and they're worrying you, then that's not going to help you. All right. So that's all I have time for today. If you want to know more about the 20 traps, go to www.empoweringmomsbirth.com/store. Okay, so again, that's www.empoweringmomsbirth.com/store. Guide that you want is the 20 traps guide. You can click on it. It will take you to the sign up page. You just sign up your email. It will be delivered right to your inbox. And then you'll get some additional tips from me as well. Okay. And I will see you next week. Talk to you soon.